When you think of a homeless person, who do you imagine? What do you believe are the root causes of family homelessness? And how will you address them in your election?
So when I think of homelessness, I know that the vast majority of people who are homeless are families, usually mom and kids, but could be other family situations. And this really goes back to the challenge of affordability in New York City. Uh, in some ways, the rent is too damn high. And so the reason we need to address this is, I think, twofold. One is we need to make sure we are building. We need to build more housing in general to deal with the supply shortage, more deeply affordable housing. So I have said that we would construct 50,000 new units, less for people who make less than $30,000. And the third piece is for folks who are experiencing homelessness and it's an affordability problem. We need to make sure that the voucher matches the market, because my understanding is maybe in 1965 you could rent an apartment for that, but it's been a while um, since that has been valuable enough to actually get you a real apartment. And we know that having a real apartment, housing heals. It allows you to pursue education, allows you to pursue a career, it allows your kids to do better. So I know that that is critical moving forward.
In 1965, you probably could buy a whole house with the amount of the voucher. So I just want to know, give us your best 2-minute pitch about how you are going to revamp the city's approach to family homelessness. Given your experience in the housing and homelessness field, how are you going to help those families?
First and foremost, we need to get people into permanent housing fast. That is first and foremost. It cannot be something that drags on for months to years. And so that means that we need to make sure that the voucher matches the market, that you can actually rent an apartment in the city of New York for that. We need to make sure that when there are vacancies at NYCHA, that those are very quickly being rehabbed for new occupancy. It often takes months. Uh, the third piece is we need to build more affordable housing so that there are options. And the fourth is really to make, just in general, construction easier so that there is more housing across the board, which will drive down prices.
Just getting back to the whole question of root causes for a second, are there any things beyond just housing issues that you think need to be done to address root causes of families ending up in homelessness?
Well, it is critical that it is an affordability issue, but this is also an economic jobs issue. That we know that if you are not well educated and helped to ensure that you have a career rather than just a degree, that being able to afford housing in the city of New York is very challenging. We need to make sure that we are opening up those pathways coming out of high school as well as coming out of our CUNY system.
How will you ensure families that leave shelters stay housed? A lot of the city's supportive housing is set aside for single adults. Do you believe the city should create a supporting housing network using the housing first model for families?
I absolutely believe that there is a spectrum of need. Not everyone will need a housing first model, but some will. And so we need to make sure that we have housing and that we have the supports to stay housed. The last thing we want to see is anyone going back into shelter and sort of looping through the system again. That is completely disruptive to families and particularly challenging for children. So I believe that and actually I would say specifically for families that have disabilities, that having supportive housing is very, very critical.
The most common reasons families go into shelter is because of domestic violence. But DV survivors in HRA emergency shelters cannot be required to the homeless affordable housing units in HPD buildings. And at the same time, they're given a quick deadline to leave the shelters would you include DV survivors in these ultimates? And what will you do to help DV survivors stay at home and not enter shelters in the first place?
So
And
I
Ms.
just
Kathryn,
want to make sure that I understand the
Yeah.
question.
Sorry.
and just to clarify, Ms. Kathryn, there are those 15% set-asides in the HPD buildings, and but it's not actually, you can't be referred directly from like an HRA emergency shelter to those allotments. You have to be coming from a DHS shelter. So she was asking both about, can it make it possible for HRA emergency units to be, people in those shelters to be able to get into the HPD units, as well as like, in general, what will you do to help DV survivors stay home, as Kata just said?
So that was one of the clarifying. So first of all, it should not matter whether or not the acronym of the agency is HRA or DSS, and the ability to get the 15% set aside should be open to either population. We want to make it as easy for DV survivors to have stable housing as we move forward. And in terms of staying at home, it is often, I just want to make sure that I understand this piece, the desire to stay at home. If there is an abuser involved, are we talking about the home with the abuser?
I would say that if there's a way to, like, maybe the abuser has left, maybe there's is there a way to stay home and not be displaced to shelter?
Right. So if it is safe, if the abuser is no longer there, then obviously supporting people to stay in an apartment they're already in, it makes a lot more sense than trying to move people into a system that will be both really a hardship for that family, but also isn't going to make it any cheaper to find an apartment.
Mhm.
Anything you'll do to help facilitate and ensure those families can stay home?
Right. No, this is really, I think the question here is, how are you protecting people from eviction? And so this means that we need to ensure that we are connecting DV survivors to those programs that ensure that you are not getting evicted from your apartment, and that if you need assistance, there is financial assistance available for that specific population facing eviction.
So DV survivors often find that the DV shelters are located in very low income neighborhoods that struggle with crime, which makes the survivors feel even less safe. How will you change this? And in general, how will you counter opposition from the high income and privileged neighborhoods to the sightings of these shelters?
Now, we need to make sure that, particularly for family shelters, but also for DV shelters, that they are in places that are rich in transit, that have good schools, so that these families can survive. I know that it is challenging. There's almost everything in New York City on land use is opposed, but I have been able to move large projects forward in my worlds, and it takes a steadfast push and the ability to use your political capital to get it done, because we know that we need to make sure that there are DV shelters in areas where there are access to jobs and access to education. I also want to say, we don't want people to stay in a DV shelter for a long time. We want them to get into permanent apartments.
So you said that you wanted to move them faster. There's already the 90-day deadline for them to leave. How would you exasperate that?
It's not a deadline for them. It is more a making sure that the apartment is available for them, that we are assisting as a government in finding them the apartment. So not to be punitive and, have a countdown clock, but to actually make it so that they are able to move out and be able to find permanent homes rather than shelter.
So when I was in the shelter, I lived in a small, it's very, very cramped space. And I found out actually my hotel cost for my shelter was $4,000. a month.
Yes.
When you think about $4,000, that's a lot of money to put on a shelter was not even your place and makes it feel like a home to you. That money could honestly have went to an apartment. So the question is for you, these days it's popular to say we need housing, not shelter. But how exactly would you move away from shelter spending and making sure there is real housing for most in need?
Right. So as you state in your question, that's just stupid on the part of government to spend $4,000 a month for something that isn't a home where, goodness gracious, we could go get a luxury apartment with some nice granite countertops or something. And so this is where we make penny wise, pound foolish decisions. What if we made it so that the voucher was closer to 2,000 even, which is a huge increase on the voucher? You're still saving 50%. And you're still creating a permanent home. And that is housing that heals. So I do not have a shelter first approach. I have a housing first approach. And to make decisions that are actually much wiser moving forward, because that is pretty dumb. It's like to spend all that money and you don't get anything for it.
Ms. Kathryn, I guess there's still that mandate that there has to be enough shelter, enough like shelter beds at any given time, right? Just because we're required to. Is there a way to somehow fulfill that, keep that requirement, still provide shelter to everyone who wants it, but at the same time move toward more permanent solutions, as you were saying?
Right, but so if you are moving people out of shelter, and now New York State Constitution requires that there be shelter for anyone who walks in the door. We don't want to take that away, but we don't want that to be a long-term option, particularly for families. We don't want them to be there in a shelter for months or years. It is actually much less expensive to move them into a permanent apartment. So yes, you don't lose the shelter system, but it should get smaller because people will leave faster.
So New York City's programs, home base and with the city FAHEPS voucher, the voucher rules keep changing. I have a voucher and I live in one of those luxury apartments with the granite tops. So my voucher is changing even now as we speak. I've even seen families displaced because the payments from the agencies are not coming through. How will you prevent, I'm in that situation, so that's why I speak to this. How will you prevent families with vouchers from getting displaced just because the city is not paying its portion? And what will you do to include landlords in the conversation once the eviction moratorium ends?
Those are two very big questions, but I'm going to start with the city should pay its bills. It actually is legally required to pay its bills within 30 days. And that should not be on the tenant. They should be, there should be coordination with the landlord in the city around ensuring that payment is made. And we need to make sure that the rules are steady because you make long-term decisions around where you're going to live. I'm glad you have granite countertops, by the way. I guess it's good for baking. But this is where I don't understand why the bureaucracy is causing there to be a hang up on paying your bills. It's one of the things that actually the controller's office is supposed to do, is make sure the bills get paid. If there are contracts in place, and obviously there is. On the issue of when the eviction moratorium ends, and it will eventually end, this is where we really need to bring together landlords and tenants and the financial services industry, because just paying the tenant to pay the landlord to pay the mortgage to somebody who's been making money on Wall Street isn't like a great use. I don't find a great use of our money as a city. But there is good news in the federal stimulus for rent relief. And I think that infusion will really help ensure that we don't have a homeless and eviction crisis. There is an opportunity for our landlords and tenants to come together and reset the bar, because it's not as if there are loads of tenants out there who are like, oh yeah, I can pay more. Nobody had any money during the pandemic. So everyone has been in that boat.
What does cancellation look like? Are there people who get rent relief and people who don't? Like, do you see it as a, like, how would you design that?
So, I mean, I think that this is going to be something where it really does matter that, what the fundamental financial situation is of both the tenant and the landlord, and where we are going to see how that works through. Because this is different than most other cities in that many landlords are very small landlords and don't have a ton of units and can't afford to actually have gone without the rent because they can't pay the utilities, and they can't pay their property taxes. So we know that those are all things that we need to come together and think about, because maybe piece of this is property tax relief to make sure that we can keep tenants. Then you also have to look at the program and say, could you have paid your rent? There's an eviction moratorium for everyone, but some people didn't lose their jobs. So we need to look at each situation individually.
Okay, Ms. Kathryn. For our homeless students, so in the 2019-2020, for the 5th year in a row, the number of students who were doubled up or living in shelters topped 100,000. So that's about 1 in every 10 students in our public and charter schools. Students without secure housing have higher rates of absenteeism, and the pandemic has only made the problem worse. Many children still don't have Wi-Fi, and it's hard for parents to monitor their children while also trying to make ends meet. How are you going to make sure that homeless children don't fall through the cracks of the education system?
And this is critically important. I have to say, I was out this morning welcoming high school kids back to James Madison who haven't been at the building in 4 months. And they are just like the teenagers you remember, like back in the day, heading to school, looking just so excited. No, not really about being back in school, but pretty happy. But this is where the city has to ensure, one, that we are moving people first and foremost into permanent housing, because housing heals. Housing allows kids to get a good education. But we also need to make schools be more community schools, where there are resources for families to make sure that they are supported. And we can't lose track of them. The horrifying thing of kids getting devices to do remote school and not having access to broadband meant that we know that there's going to be a tremendous amount of catching up to do, and also a tremendous amount of emotional support needed for kids who've been isolated for such a long period of time. This is why I've said that for very young children, we have to have free childcare for people who make under $70,000 a year. That we have to make it so that there is continued devices and Wi-Fi access for kids, even when they are back in a physical classroom. That we need to have resources at schools. The biggest factor in whether or not a kid succeeds in school is if their mother is literate. And if they have access to that piece of education, their kid is way more successful. And that's what we want to see.
In 2016, they put DHS and HRA together into one system. Steve Banks was put in charge of it. How do you feel about why the way DHS and HRA were combined? And what would you do differently as a mayor to make those systems run successfully?
So I think that this is, and actually it's a back to the future situation, because DHS actually was an HRA, as was ACS, and then they got removed. They became separate agencies, and now they're back together. It is a combination only at the very top. It is not a seamless combination across every level of that agency, so that there are real wraparound services, whether or not it is about the need for shelter, or the need for food, or the need for workforce development, that this is not actually operating as a joint. It still operates as two agencies rather than as one agency. And the way that I would approach anything on the health and human services side is, what does that family need? And then let's make sure that we are bringing those resources to that family. And the family doesn't have to figure out like, oh yes, I have a right to come in and get shelter and pursue getting an apartment. But oh, you know what? I also am eligible for SNAP benefits, or I'm also eligible for Medicaid. That should happen all as one seamless program. And to my knowledge, that is not what occurs. So they still operate in silos, even though Steve Banks is at the top.
Circling back to, instead of building more shelters, to build, to constructing more housing. So there are a lot of abandoned buildings. And recently, a young woman was murdered in an abandoned warehouse. These buildings could create housing. Would you, as mayor, consider renovating those abandoned buildings to be utilized for such a purpose, to either create more housing, affordable housing, or even to structure them as a shelter, since, they're already there?
Yeah, I'm absolutely open to both abandoned, but we may have office buildings that are not going to be utilized much in the future if work is still very remote. We may have hotels that go out of business that could be converted into permanent housing. The only thing that I would say is I want that to be located near where there are schools and transit and neighborhood amenities, so that you're not in an industrial area. I think that putting a family in an industrial area would be a disservice.
Okay. Would you consider making it for single men, or, single men maybe? And I ask that because it seems like all of our city services, a lot of them cater to the men, which is how, the shelter system pretty much seems to have come about with Mr. Banks as lead lawyer. So could those be converted into shelters in that area?
They could. I mean, it's also like, but the one thing that I have learned, particularly about single men, is that they actually seem to have certain locations that they prefer.
Mhm.
And that they don't take the shelter if it is not somewhat where their sort of home stomping grounds are.
Mhm. Yes.
But I'm very open to coming up with creative solutions to ensure that there is shelter and homes for people.